Remember when Shout could turn any Isley Brothers show into one giant party? Somehow, their sound survived long enough to become part of Ice Cube's generation, but the brothers themselves weren't nearly as lucky. Marvin lost both legs to a surprisingly common illness, while two of the original Isleys eventually ended up in court fighting over 50% ownership of the family name. What happened between them was even more surprising. So, let's find out the truth. Firstly, let's look at the familiar voice behind it all. Ronald Isley. Back in 1959, Ronald Isley was only 18 when Shout became the song that put the brothers on the map. He was skinny, baby-faced, usually dressed in matching suits with O'Kelly and Rudolph, but once the music started, Ronald was the one dropping to his knees and pushing that unmistakable tenor over the rest of the group. If that's the Ronald you remember, you might be surprised by just how different he looks today. Ronald turned 85 in 2026, and obviously, 6 decades have changed him quite a bit. He's much heavier than the thin teenager from those early photographs. His beard is completely white, and he almost never seems to appear without his dark sunglasses anymore. He's also traded those simple matching suits for velvet jackets, jewelry, and much more expensive-looking clothes. In fact, if you only knew Ronald from his Mr. Biggs years, his current style probably isn't that surprising. He's basically grown into that character. But outside of the stage, Ronald seems to live a fairly quiet life these days. Recent birthday photos show him smiling with friends and family, rather than trying to hide from the fact that he's getting older. And the person you'll notice beside him more and more is his wife, Candy Isley. Now, their relationship has always gotten attention for one obvious reason. Candy is 34 years younger than Ronald. They married in 2005, when Ronald was already in his 60s, and considering how celebrity marriages with age gaps like that usually get talked about, plenty of people probably didn't expect this one to last. Yet more than 20 years later, they're still together. Ronald and Candy also have a son, Ronald Isley Jr., and today much of Ronald's personal life revolves around that family. He has long had connections to St. Louis and has also spent his later years with his family in Los Angeles. In January 2026, Candy and their son were right there with him when the Isley Brothers received their star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. And that's actually a pretty big change from the Ronald we started with. He used to be the little brother surrounded by O'Kelly and Rudolph. Now Ronald is the old man of the family, with his own wife and son standing around him instead. Unfortunately, getting to 85 has also started catching up with him physically. In the summer of 2026, Ronald spent 5 weeks in the hospital battling a serious illness. That's a long hospital stay for anyone, but especially concerning for a man in his mid-80s. And somehow, he did. When Ronald returned for a Philadelphia show in August, Candy reportedly had to help him walk onto the stage. He also performed from a chair because he wasn't strong enough to spend the show standing. Now compare that with the Ronald people remember from Shout. This was a guy who used to drop onto his knees and move around the stage like he had unlimited energy. In 2026, he needed his wife's arm just to get out there. But honestly, an 85-year-old needing a chair isn't the shocking part. The shocking part is that after 5 weeks in the hospital, he apparently still looked at his schedule and decided, yeah, I'm going back to work. And Ronald really hasn't retired. The Isley Brothers were still performing in 2026, including their August appearance at Philadelphia's Dell Music Center. So we're talking about someone whose first major hit came in 1959, when Dwight Eisenhower was still president, who was still performing for paying audiences 67 years later. That's pretty ridiculous when you actually think about it. Of course, Ronald's later years haven't all been birthday parties and lifetime achievement moments. One of the strangest chapters happened with the brother who had been standing beside him since the very beginning. In 2023, Rudolph Isley sued Ronald over the trademark to the Isley Brothers name. Basically, Ronald had registered the trademark in his own name, while Rudolph believed the two brothers should share ownership. And regardless of which side you think was right, there's something pretty sad about two men in their 80s arguing in federal court over the name they had been performing under since they were kids. The dispute continued with his estate and heirs before finally being settled in 2026, according to the information available in August. So Ronald's life at 85 is actually a strange mix. Now he's 85, his beard is white, he needs a little more help getting around, and sometimes he has to sing sitting down. But somehow, Ronald Isley still hasn't left the stage. And while Ronald somehow managed to stay on stage into his 80s, his younger brother Marvin Isley had his time there taken away from him far too soon. Marvin wasn't part of the original Isley Brothers that older fans first heard singing "Shout." He belonged to the family's younger generation, joining officially in 1973 at just 20 years old alongside Ernie Isley and Chris Jasper. With his huge afro, thick black beard, and colorful stage clothes, Marvin looked every bit like the new funk generation, and his bass helped the Isleys sound like one too. That's what makes the photographs from his final years so difficult to look at. By 2008 and 2009, the young musician who once stood on stage with a bass strapped across his body was living in Chicago and reportedly relying completely on a wheelchair. His health had been deteriorating for years because of diabetes, and by then he was also dealing with serious kidney complications. But this wasn't something that suddenly happened when Marvin reached old age. In fact, he never got the chance to become an old man. His problems had become so severe that both of his legs were amputated in 1997, when Marvin was only in his 40s. For a bass player whose entire adult life had revolved around standing on stage and performing, that's a pretty devastating way for a career to end. And it becomes even harder to believe when you go back to footage of Marvin in the 1970s. We can hear his influence across the group's funkier records, including "Fight the Power," while the music created during this era would eventually find an entirely new audience through hip-hop sampling. Even Between the Sheets, released a decade after Marvin officially joined, became one of those Isley records that younger listeners often knew without realizing just how old the original music was. Unfortunately, Marvin's body began failing him while that music was still finding new generations. Diabetes eventually forced him away from performing, and after losing his legs, his life looked nothing like those old photographs of the bearded young bassist in flamboyant 1970s clothes. By his mid-50s, the afro was long gone, the stage was behind him, and his mobility had been taken away. But Marvin didn't completely disappear. During his later years, he spoke publicly about diabetes and reportedly became involved in raising awareness of the disease, particularly within the Black community. And that's probably one of the more overlooked parts of his story. He could no longer change what diabetes had done to him, but he could at least use what happened to warn other people. Sadly, his condition continued getting worse. On June 6, 2010, Marvin Isley died in Chicago from complications related to diabetes. He was only 56 years old, just a couple of months away from his 57th birthday. And 56 feels incredibly young when you put Marvin next to Ronald today. Ronald is still performing at 85, while his younger brother never even made it to 60. For fans who remember Marvin during the 3+3 era, that's probably the most shocking then and now comparison of all. The young bassist with the giant afro, thick beard, and seemingly endless energy didn't slowly grow old in front of his audience. His illness removed him from the stage, took both of his legs, confined him to a wheelchair, and eventually ended his life decades earlier than anyone would have expected. Marvin never got the chance to grow old with the group. His brother Ernie did, and surprisingly, he's still on stage today. Ernie Isley was 21 when he officially joined the Isley Brothers in 1973, bringing a huge afro, a tall, lean frame, and a completely different energy to the family group. He wasn't there simply to sing behind his older brothers. Ernie could play drums, write songs, and, most importantly, make a guitar scream. His unforgettable solo on That Lady became one of the defining sounds of the Isleys' 1970s peak. These days, Ernie is 74, and he's definitely not the lanky young guitarist people remember from the 3+3 years. The afro is completely gone, his head is shaved, his face is much fuller, and the wrinkles around his forehead and eyes make his age impossible to miss. He's also noticeably heavier than the young man staring back from those old album covers. But Ernie still carries some of that old rock star swagger. Put an electric guitar in his hands, and suddenly the guy from those 1970s records doesn't seem quite so far away. His private life has actually been remarkably stable as well. Ernie has been married to his wife, Tracy Isley, since 1998, meaning they're approaching 3 decades together. They have one daughter, Alex Isley, and she didn't exactly run away from the family business. Alex became an R&B singer-songwriter herself and has earned a Grammy nomination. So, the musical talent that once passed from the older Isleys to Ernie and Marvin has now made its way into another generation of the family. And Ernie himself never really stopped being the guitar player. At an age when most musicians would be perfectly justified in enjoying retirement, he was still touring with Ronald in 2026. And with Ronald now 85 and physically slowing down, Ernie has become even more important on stage. He's the one still standing there with the electric guitar, supplying much of the instrumental energy behind songs the brothers first recorded decades ago. What's interesting is that Ernie's music hasn't stayed trapped in 2026 either. Nearly 50 years later, one of the songs he helped create suddenly found itself attached to one of the biggest names in modern music. In 2022, Beyoncé joined the Isley Brothers for a new version of "Make Me Say It Again, Girl," a song originally released in 1975 and co-written by Ernie. Think about that for a second. Ernie helped write the original when he was a young man in his 20s, and almost half a century later, Beyoncé was singing on its remake. That's a pretty unusual second life for a song. Ernie has also spent part of his later years passing that experience directly to younger musicians. He has worked as a musical mentor through schools and community programs, and has returned as a guest lecturer at Berklee College of Music in Boston. In 2016, Berklee went one step further and awarded him an honorary Doctor of Music degree. And physically, he's held up surprisingly well. At 74, Ernie can still spend long stretches of a concert standing with an electric guitar strapped around him. That's impressive enough on its own, but it becomes much more noticeable when you see him beside Ronald today. His older brother increasingly has to conserve his energy and may perform sitting down, while Ernie is still expected to stand up and deliver those familiar guitar parts. It's a strange reversal from where they started. Ernie entered the group as one of the young guys. Ronald, Rudolph, and O'Kelly were already established stars, while Ernie, Marvin, and Chris Jasper were the younger musicians being brought into the family operation. Now that famous 6-man lineup has been reduced by time and loss, and Ernie has gone from being one of its youngest members to one of the men left carrying its sound. Ronald carries the voice, and Ernie carries much of the sound. That's why seeing the two of them touring in 2026 doesn't quite feel like watching a normal nostalgia act. These aren't two replacement musicians trying to recreate somebody else's records. Ronald and Ernie were actually there. For fans who bought That Lady, Fight the Power, or Summer Breeze. When those records were new, Ernie's guitar isn't somebody recreating a memory. It's the same man who helped make that memory in the first place. Go back to the original Isley Brothers and Rudolph is hard to miss. The tall young man standing beside O'Kelly and Ronald, adding his deep baritone to those gospel-style harmonies. He wasn't the brother grabbing most of the attention on Shout, but he was there from the beginning, helping hold both the sound and the family together. By his 80s, that life was almost unrecognizable. Rudolph had been away from the stage for more than 3 decades, living a much quieter life in Illinois and devoting himself to his Christian faith. He had left the Isley Brothers in 1989 and moved into ministry, trading packed concert halls and endless touring for something far more private. And honestly, Rudolph seemed like the brother least likely to end up in another major Isley Brothers controversy. He wasn't trying to restart his performing career, he wasn't competing with Ronald for the spotlight. By 2021 and 2022, Rudolph was already 82 and 83 years old, but he remained mentally sharp and involved enough to keep track of the musical legacy and assets the brothers had spent decades building. Then something happened behind the scenes that completely changed his final years. In November 2021, Ronald applied to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to register the Isley Brothers as a federal trademark under his own name. According to Rudolph's later lawsuit, Ronald did it without consulting him or getting his approval. That sounds like a boring piece of legal paperwork until you realize what Rudolph believed was at stake. After their older brother O'Kelly died, Rudolph maintained that he and Ronald each held a 50% interest in the Isley Brothers' name. From Rudolph's perspective, this wasn't Ronald protecting the name of a band he was currently touring with. It was one brother claiming sole control over something they had spent most of their lives creating together. And these weren't two musicians who had met in a recording studio. Rudolph had been beside Ronald since Ronald was the kid brother of the family. In those early years, he and O'Kelly weren't just singing harmonies behind him. As the older brothers, they helped look after Ronald while the group traveled across America, often under the difficult conditions black performers faced during segregation. They had gone through all of that together. Now, more than 60 years later, the name attached to those memories was becoming the thing pulling them apart. What makes the timing even stranger is that while this was developing privately, Rudolph was receiving some of the biggest recognition of his career. In June 2022, the Isley Brothers were inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame. Rudolph had helped co-write early classics including Shout. And now, decades after stepping away from the stage, the songwriting behind the family catalog was still being honored. For a retired man in his 80s, that could have been a pretty satisfying final chapter. It wasn't. Just 2 months later, in August 2022, Ronald's trademark registration was approved. Once Rudolph discovered what had happened, he wasn't willing to simply let it go. And this is where the quiet retired minister suddenly became part of a very public family fight. In March 2023, Rudolph sued Ronald. He was 84 years old. There is something almost surreal about that when you compare it with those old photographs. The young Rudolph and Ronald had once stood shoulder to shoulder in matching suits, trying to get strangers to remember the Isley name. Now, one of the last surviving members of that original trio was taking the other to federal court over who actually owned it. Ronald, of course, had a different side to the story. Rudolph had retired from the group decades earlier, while Ronald continued performing and using the Isley Brothers' name commercially. Ronald therefore disputed his brother's claim to shared ownership. So legally, the case was more complicated than simply saying Ronald took the name from Rudolph. Personally, though, it was hard not to see the sadness in it. They were talking through lawyers. The saddest part is that they never got much time to resolve it. On October 11, 2023, only months after filing the lawsuit, Rudolph died at his home in Illinois. He was 84 years old, and his wife Elaine said that he had suffered a heart attack. Because Rudolph died before the trademark dispute could be resolved, his estate continued the fight against Ronald. So one of the final disagreements between the brothers actually lasted longer than Rudolph himself. And it wouldn't finally end until 2026. That year, Ronald and Rudolph's estate reached a settlement bringing the trademark litigation to a close. And maybe that's what makes his later life so different from the other Isleys we've talked about. The songs still carried his writing credits. The group was still being honored for music he helped create. For older fans, that makes those early pictures look a little different today. Rudolph's life didn't end on stage like you might expect from someone who helped create one of America's longest-running R&B groups. It ended quietly in Illinois after more than 3 decades away from performing. And finally, there's O'Kelly, the oldest brother, and surprisingly, the first of the original trio to be gone. Rudolph spent his final years fighting for the Isley name, but the brother who had once helped keep that family together was already long gone. O'Kelly Isley Jr. was the broad, handsome eldest brother of the original trio. The warm baritone beside Ronald and Rudolph, who helped write Shout and brought a stricter, protective presence to the family from the very beginning. By 1984, though, O'Kelly was approaching 47, and things around him were starting to fall apart. The famous six-man version of the Isley Brothers had reached the end of its run. Ernie Isley, Marvin Isley, and Chris Jasper broke away to form Isley-Jasper Isley, leaving O'Kelly with Ronald and Rudolph. In a weird way, the brothers had almost gone back to where they started. 3 men, 3 voices, 1 family name. Except this time they weren't young guys trying to get their first hit. They were middle-aged stars trying to figure out whether the Isley brothers could survive another major breakup. And O'Kelly had another problem that most fans didn't know about. He was sick. By 1985, the physical change was becoming difficult to ignore. Kelly had always been the bigger, heavier brother, the one whose broad frame made him immediately recognizable in old photographs. But now, he was losing a significant amount of weight. This wasn't some late career makeover. Behind the scenes, O'Kelly was reportedly battling cancer. And somehow, while dealing with that, he was also trying to help put the Isley brothers back together. The remaining trio returned in 1985 with Masterpiece. For O'Kelly, the album gave fans something relatively unusual. Instead of simply providing the deep harmony underneath Ronald, he stepped forward to sing lead on If Leaving Me Is Easy. It's one of those performances that becomes a little strange to revisit once you know what was happening to him. But near the end of his life, there he was singing a vulnerable ballad out front himself. And he looked noticeably different. His hair was shorter and more conservative than during the flamboyant 1970s. His clothes had returned to relatively simple suits, and most importantly, that famously large frame was shrinking. Still, there was no public farewell. O'Kelly hadn't announced that he was done. He wasn't sitting at home reminiscing about the old days. The brothers had just made another album, and there were plans to keep working. That's why what happened next was so sudden. On March 31st, 1986, O'Kelly suffered a heart attack at his home in Alpine, New Jersey. He died at just 48 years old, and that's probably the detail that makes his story hit differently from the other brothers. He never got the long, gray-haired retirement years people usually imagine when looking back at musicians from the 1950s. His then and now happened incredibly fast. One year, fans were watching him reunite with Ronald and Rudolph and trying to rebuild the group. The next year, he was gone. And the irony is that Kelly had always looked like the strong one. O'Kelly was known as the disciplined one, helping keep the younger brothers focused and protecting them from some of the problems that came with touring and the music business. He also helped create the sound itself. His warm baritone sat underneath Ronald's tenor, and he shared songwriting credit on records including Shout. Later, as the family became increasingly independent, Kelly also became involved in the business side of T-Neck Records. Basically, O'Kelly spent much of his adult life being the brother who helped keep things organized, which makes the timing of his death even more unfortunate. The family was already going through one of its biggest changes. Ronald and Rudolph continued without him, but the balance of the family could never really be the same. Rudolph eventually left the stage for Christian ministry. Ronald carried the Isley brothers' name forward. Decades later, the 2 surviving brothers would even end up fighting in court over ownership of that name. O'Kelly missed all of it. And for O'Kelly, who only lived to 48, that's as close to a now as fans were ever going to get. And that is what became of the Isley brothers, who turned a family act into one of the longest-lasting names in R&B. Some lived long enough to see their music reach entirely new generations, while others were gone far sooner than anyone expected. But after all the success, loss, illness, and even family conflict, those records are still playing more than 6 decades later. Which Isley brother surprised you the most? And which song still takes you back the moment you hear it? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more unforgettable then and now stories.